I'm Scott Allen Miller. This is Sam IT. Today I'm going to tell a little bit of an anecdote. One of the most important things that I got as like a takeaway in my early days of IT. When I started in IT, I actually had a mentor, a professional sysops person who was teaching classes at the university where I was attending. I wasn't going for IT, but I was working in the IT department at the university. And one of the best lessons that I learned while I was there, and it's amazing to me now that so early in my career, I had someone tell me something that ended up being so fundamental and memorable. And it has affected me a lot over the years, both the general case and then some specific examples that I'll bring up. But the general case was, IT doesn't customize anything. In your environment, you don't customize. End users, which includes developers, they customize. They're going to tweak their desktop so it looks just right. They're going to install all kinds of special applications. They're going to make shortcuts and maybe modify how applications work or look so that they're just right for them. Because it's all about efficiency. Our job in IT is to support them. Their job is to be efficient in doing their jobs. But for IT, we will always have to work on a variety of environments, and we will often have to work on those environments under cases of failure, under failure situations. So something has gone wrong with the server, something has gone wrong with the desktop. We have to be able to work using the tools at hand as the system was designed to be used. And quite often, we're not going to have our customizations when it matters. So having them when it doesn't matter only sets us up for failure. It makes us less likely to be prepared for the cases where it really does matter. And so we don't customize. We don't put time into those things because they're simply bad for us. It may seem like a minor thing, but when you get to the point where you're in an emergency situation, you're going to appreciate being familiar and having all of your interactions be at a default, because that's when you're going to need it. And when you're working, and this is much less common, when you're working on other people's environments, yeah, they may have customizations, you may have to deal with their customizations, but that's relatively rare, and normally when you're working with those situations, they're not failure modes, they're just support modes. So a very specific example of this that we were given, I'll give a few. One real common is customizing things like aliases in Unix, right? People will sometimes alias a whole bunch of things and forget what the actual commands are. This is even more popular with PowerShell because their commands tend to be so long, so people have a tendency to create aliases or short little scripts that put things together. It's one thing when you're building a full support automation environment. Obviously, we have to do that. But trying to simplify really simple things like typing a command can be very problematic when you need to be able to type those commands quickly under pressure. In Windows, it might be customizing how our desktop reacts to us, right? How the start menu looks or just whatever. We want to avoid those things. But a great example that was given to me, and this is an amazing one that this general case has played out so importantly for me throughout my career, and it's a bit of advice I've given to a lot of people over the years, and a very specific one is the VI application. When you work on Unix, VI is the absolute fundamental text editor that is available everywhere. It's just always there. It's tiny. It's a pain in the butt to actually use. The commands are obscure. It dates from like the early 1970s. It really hasn't changed all that time. And learning how to do it can be to use it can be very annoying, especially for people who are new to the Unix space, new to Linux or BSD or whatever. So a lot of people like to skip it. They want to use Nano or Joe or something else. They look at this old tool and they say, that is so old. You know, I live in a different era. I don't work with those things anymore. And for the most part, you can get away without ever using it. If you read a lot of stuff on the internet, people recommend using Nano. And these days, you can almost assume you're going to always have Nano, but not quite, especially not on my machines. If you're working on mine, you're going to find that it's not there in many cases, not because I remove it, but because I don't install it. Anything that has to be installed specifically for you to be able to do basic tasks represents a risk that you can avoid. So I was taught to always learn how to use VI, to become proficient in it, and just assume that it's the one thing that I would know would always be available to me when working as a Unix administrator. So one day, in my first really large-scale Unix administration job, which this was amazing, I was working at IBM, and someone came running into my office one day and said, production is down, there is not a single Unix administrator in the building who can edit files or access anything on the computers. We are down, it's an emergency, can you come take a look? I said, sure. So I went down to the production floor, and there were a certain number of things that had broken, things needed to be fixed. But fundamentally, the things that were broken weren't the problem. The problem was there was nobody who knew how to edit the text files to change configurations to get the machine back up and running. So all it required was that I was the one person with knowledge of VI. I was able to fire it up, make the changes, save the file, and the machine started working again. A little bit more complex than that, but that was the differentiating factor. And it's amazing that that actually played out, not just as a theoretical risk and not just an example that something similar. It was the exact program that I was taught to always know how to use in 1994 when I took my first classes and started working in Unix administration. And it wasn't until 2001 probably when this event actually occurred. But it was an amazing playing out of exactly that lesson so many years later. So I've been very thankful to my mentor for having taught me that lesson. It's one that's stuck with me and I've passed on to a lot of people, but one that really matters and is going to continue to matter. The world is not changing so quickly that we can assume having standard tools is not going to be a challenge for us in the future. That is going to continue to be a challenge, and especially if you're like me and work in something like an ITSP or an MSP space where you're constantly working with different environments, or you tend to move from job to job fairly frequently, you will very quickly learn that every environment is vastly different, and knowing the baselines of different systems is what's going to make it simple for you to quickly get in and interact and work, and the things that you start to rely on at a job because you're always having access to those tools will change. Things that you have no idea will change. I'll just give another quick example. I spent a lot of time working in the large Windows space in the enterprise, and those familiar with Windows, especially about 2012 R2 and earlier, very, very commonly we use the RSAT tools. They were always deployed on desktops, always available. It was so common, you just assumed that's how you would work with Windows. And most environments use them, and they're great tools. There's a reason why people use them. But I then went to a large investment firm and found that not only did they not have the tools available or deployed, but the entire Windows department had never heard of them and were not aware that Microsoft made tools of that nature and didn't have them approved for use, and so couldn't roll them out. And they had to work using a completely different set of tools. They also were not using PowerShell, so many of the things you would commonly rely on were not in use, but were those, at least like PowerShell, was available. You could log into any machine, have PowerShell, have the command prompt, and those things would work. So learning the baselines, knowing how to work without any additional tools to make your life easy is very important. That's not to say that we should never have tools to make things easier. There are many cases where we need tools to be efficient, but we need to be cognizant that we will not always have access to the tools we assume that we will, that whether it's business changes or technology changes or career opportunity changes will potentially put us in a position where those things are not available, and we need to be able to adapt, and having a strong baseline knowledge of administration will behoove us greatly. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe. I hope you found this educational and that it conveyed an important message. And if you want to support us, you can do so on Patreon.